The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Tally Olson. We are back. Retro Rangers in the Zone. The host is George Grimm, and I present you with him. How you doing, George?
Good. Okay, welcome back to the Retro Rangers podcast. I'm thrilled to be here this evening with two of my sports writing heroes, Hal Bock of the Associated Press and Gerry Eskenazi of the New York Times. And we're going to talk about Emile Francis, the late great Emile Francis, who passed away on Saturday at the age of 95. All right, gentlemen, I just want to thank you for both coming. Let me lay down some information about Emile before we get started. He was born November 13th in 1926 in North Battleford, Saskatchewan, where it gets very cold in the wintertime. Emile once told me that they used frozen horse turds for pucks up there. He used to call them road apples. He also wanted to be a goalkeeper because they played the whole game. And I don't know if you ever noticed, but Emile always said goalkeeper. He never said goalie or goaltender or netminder. He always said goalkeeper. I don't know why, but he did. The cat got his nickname from a guy named Scotty Melvin, who was a sports writer, who saw him play for the Moose Jaw Canucks, and he said he was as quick as a cat. He made his NHL debut with the Chicago Blackhawks in 46-47. While he was in Chicago, he invented the modern catching glove and the other glove, the glove that they blocked the puck with while he was with the Blackhawks. He was traded to the Rangers in 1948, where he served mostly as a backup to Charlie Rayner. He played in 95 NHL games. He had a 3.75 goals against average. And at 5'6", 145 pounds, he was very small, but he was very tough. He lost 18 teeth, and he had his nose broken 5 times. He had over 250 stitches in his face. He suffers from torn ligaments in both his knees, and when he finished playing, he needed ankle and shoulder surgery. When he retired, he was supposed to take a job with the Chicago Blackhawks to coach in their minor league system, but the Blackhawks took their time making the arrangements, and Muzz Patrick reached out and grabbed him for the Rangers. He put him in charge of the Grove Royals, and he coached John Rattel and Roger Bear down there, and they later came up to the Rangers with him. He came to the Rangers in '63 as an assistant GM. He took over the team in '64, went behind the bench in '65. He reorganized the franchise from top to bottom. He installed systems. With the Rangers and also with their all the other teams in their franchise, and he put and in 1966-67 he made the playoffs for the first time, and they actually made the playoffs for the next 9 years. They reached the playoffs in 1972 where they lost to the Bruins. He moved on to the St. Louis Blues when he left the Rangers. He also worked for the Hartford Whalers. He was put into the Hockey Hall of Fame in 1982. And he also often said that his years with the Rangers were the best years of his life. And I can see why. So tell me, gentlemen, Let's hear about Emile Francis.
Well, let me start off. Excuse me. Let me start off. I was working for the Rangers in 1962. I was working as an assistant in the PR office, and Emile joined us that year, October of '62. Now, either of you is a historian. You know that in October of '62, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Right.
And every day was, it was very shaky around here. And I remember one day coming into the office, and people were pretty grim. Who knew what was going to happen next? And Emile came in, and he was dancing. He couldn't have been happier. And he had an office right next to mine. And I said, Cat, why are you so happy? Do you know what's going on in the world? He said, I know what's going on in the world. Take a look at this map. And they had a map of the missile range from Cuba. And he said, look at that. North Battlefield is out of the range of the missiles. He was thrilled. His hometown was safe. Never mind New York, you know. So that was one of my earliest interactions with Emile. He was a terrific guy. And he was quick as a cat. He was smart as a cat. He knew those players. He knew what their strengths were, and he knew who to put with whom, and they succeeded pretty quickly. Once he became the general manager, and he put together Rod and John Rattel, and later Vic Hadfield joined that line, the goal of game line. He was a master of reading his players and knowing who to put where.
Yes, he was.
He was also, if I can interject, Hal, he was also a master of manipulating the press as well.
What? What's that? No kidding, Gerry.
Yeah. Hi there. He was really probably the most fascinating character I met in the world of hockey. And I remember early on when he was trying to bring some toughness to the Rangers. Remember, he said, "If they can fit through the door, I don't want them." You know.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
And he was trying to get them to play the body, you know, and all that. And so he was bringing in some big guys, and finally, you know, I remember they won this game, and he was very happy. And he said that, look at this. He said we had 42 hits. In other words, it's when you hit the guy after the play, you know, at the end of the play, and took him out of the play for that moment. So I said, wow, 42 hits is a lot. I said, how many did the other guys have? Maybe it was Chicago. And he said, I don't know. He says 25. So the next game, same thing. You know, he's talking about getting this big team together and, you know, hits. And he said, tonight, gentlemen, we had 40 hits. And I said, how many for the other guys? And he says, I don't know. I don't keep track of their hits. You know, so he just made it up out of whole cloth, but he was trying to make his point, you know. And that was he was just an interesting guy. Believed in a conservative style of play, I think, and he ran the whole organization from top to bottom. I don't know whether he had his hand in as many things when Hal started out as an office boy there, but he really he actually would be in charge of making bus reservations. He made plane reservations. I saw him make hotel reservations. He was just an amazing guy with this little pad he kept in his pocket.
You know, you mentioned before about he liked big guys. We had a guy on the team in 62, 63, and a little bit after that as well, named Camille Henry. Camille was a left wing, and he was a little guy. He was not a big guy. But he liked to stay in front of the net, and he'd be very good on rebounds and stuff like that. And he was a very popular player with the fans. And Emile decided to trade him to the Blackhawks in exchange for two big guys, Doug Robinson, who was a forward, and Wayne Hillman, who was a defenseman. And the trade was not a popular one because Camille was a popular player.
Right.
So now, the day he made the trade, we were playing a game that night, and by that time I was already covering the team for the Associated Press, and we went into what passed for an interview room. It's like another dressing room, and we had a reporter from the Newark News, which no longer exists, named Mel Woody, and Mel was a big guy and a strong guy, and he was questioning Emile about the trade, and it got a little contentious. At one point, where here's Emile Francis, 5'6" or so.
5'6", yeah.
He's taking off his jacket and he's going to fight with Mel Woody. No, that's not going to be good. We can't have that, you know. So the writers who were there separated the two of them and calmed it down. But that was the way Emile was. If he believed in something, he was going to defend it with his fists. I remember another time, and Gerry will remember this as well, when Emile went into the stands after the goal judge on a goal, Arthur Reichert, I think it was.
Arthur Reichert, yes.
He allowed a goal, he called a goal against Jockerman, Eddie Jockerman, and Emile was furious, and he went into the stands, and it started a riot because fans started beating on Emile, and the Rangers went over the glass. About 8 Ranger players went over the glass into the stands. It was quite a scene.
I have this image of Vic Hadfield scaling the Herculite glass, which was, about 8 feet high, 9 feet high, in his skates, and, get into the fray and all that. It was one of the wildest scenes I've ever seen in sports.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. So that was Emile. You know, he was a tough character. I mean, for a little guy, he was very feisty.
Very feisty, yep. He was tough. He's a good man, though.
And he transformed the franchise and made them a perennial contender.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
They had been a struggling team when he came into New York, and shortly thereafter they became a contender.
And he had this crazy thing about, everything with him was the team and keeping the team together. He didn't want them in Manhattan because he thought that bad things happened to you in Manhattan, especially these guys were all Canadian. When Hal and I were doing hockey back then in the 60s, every player in the league was Canadian, not just, not just 90%. Yeah, there was what they call the odd American, maybe once, or maybe there'd be a Swede once. But essentially for years there'd be 100% American. Well, he took the whole New York Rangers team, except for Roger Bear, who liked the big life in Manhattan, and he got them all living out in the suburbs in Long Island, and they lived in Long Beach, and they practiced on Long Island, and so the only time they came to Madison Square Garden was they came by bus the day of the game. Or sometimes they'd sleep. They'd sleep overnight in a hotel in the city. But he did not want them in the city at all. He wanted where he could keep an eye on them. And he had his spies. He had his neighbors and their neighbors spying on his players because all the people in Long Island, they were thrilled that Emile Francis wants us to watch out for Harry Howell. To look at Ron Stewart. Quite a guy.
And you mentioned earlier that he was a control freak. I mean, he took care of everything. They had a traveling secretary, but the traveling secretary didn't do very much. Emile took care of the arrangements. Emile took care of the hotels and the flights and everything else. He was a one-man show, I'll tell you. And he was a terrific guy to be around. He was a fun guy to be around. I think Gerry would agree with that. He was a fun guy to be around. He was a storyteller, and he was just a terrific guy. I have great memories of being around him.
Yeah. His stories were wonderful. A lot of stories. Yeah, his stories were wonderful. And Hal, did he ever tell you about his baseball days when he was playing baseball, up in Canada? And the kind of fights he used to get into and all that. He was just a fun guy.
And another thing, Gerry, that he's not remembered for it particularly, but he was the moving force about getting junior hockey going here in New York.
Right.
And now now kids on the island, and in fact the Rangers have a defenseman who won the Norris Trophy. Kid comes from Syosset. I mean, who ever heard of that? But he was a moving force about getting the Metropolitan Hockey Association, the junior hockey group, going. He saw kids playing roller hockey, and he said, "The hell with that! They should be on ice." And he helped organize the Metropolitan Junior Hockey Association.
Right. Well, that's how.
He saw the kids on roller skates in the street, and he organized the Metropolitan Junior Hockey Association. They had teams from Westchester County, New Jersey, Long Island, Queens. 7 teams, I believe.
Yeah. And he also had Brian Mullen, who came up through that league, and his brother Joey. I think Nick Fatillo played in the Met League. So it was very, very good for hockey in the city, and the area.
Yeah, the control thing about him. I remember one fall in the '60s. I went up to Kitchener, Ontario, because we would start covering them in the fall when I began writing hockey, and I go up there with my wife and my daughter, who was about 8 months old and 9 months old, and Emile sees me coming in with my wife. And he goes over to the clerk at the front desk, and he says, "Put him in the back somewhere." And he did not want any distractions. He did not want any women around. And that was his thing, So the three of us were way stranded all the way in the back of this Holiday Inn. It was probably a $10 a night motel. But can you imagine a guy who was also the traveling secretary? I mean, he acted as a statistician. It just was incredible. But
he was a one-man gang. He was the New York Rangers for those 10 years or so.
Yeah.
I remember John Halligan, the longtime PR guy, very, very much loved guy, and very, and had his finger in a lot of things on the Rangers. He called Emile a bear because of the work he did. Just was a remarkable kind of operative. The kind that as they say, they don't make anymore.
No,
you're right about that, Gerry.
Yeah. He had a good life, and he had a good career.
He was very cocksure of himself. He wasn't afraid to make moves. He traded John Rattel and Brad Park, two of the mainstays of his team, to Boston in exchange for Phil Esposito and Carol Vadnais. It was a rock'em sock'em trade. That kind of trade isn't made. Those are 4 major players who exchanged teams. Then he put Eddie Jockerman on waivers. Eddie Jockerman was a beloved goalie. Beloved. And he felt that Jockerman's best days were behind him, and he wanted to move on to he had other goalies. He had John Davidson, John Van Beesbrook. And so he wanted to move on, and he wasn't afraid to make the move. And Jockerman... The day after Jockerman was claimed by the Detroit Red Wings, who shows up in Madison Square Garden to play the Rangers but the Detroit Red Wings? Very emotional night. Jockerman had tears in his eyes playing goal against his old buddies, But Emile, when Emile decided to make a move, he made the move. He was not afraid of it, He didn't have. He was not going to be second guessed. He decided what the right move was to make, and he made it.
All right. He made some good ones and some bad ones. He made some very good trades and some not so good. There was a lot of players who ended up on other teams who turned out to be very good players, and the Rangers could have used them, but for whatever reason, he got rid of them. And but otherwise everything worked out for him. He made the playoffs 9 years in a row, and he did get to the finals. He didn't win, but he did get the team to the finals. So.
I'm curious what you fellas think about this. I think the title of his memoir was "We Did Everything But Win."
That's right.
And I always thought, now tell me if you think differently, or you have your own thoughts about why they didn't. Because they were good enough to win. Of course, Boston was on the ascendancy just when they were at their peak as well. But I always felt that had he given Rod Gilbert his head and let him get away a little more, but everything was him was getting up and down your wing. Your right wing, you get up and down your right side. Your left wing, up and down the left side. He didn't want, but I always felt that in a championship series, some guy has to come above the flock and lead it. And he never allowed Rod to really break free. That was my feeling. I always thought that if he had, maybe he could have captured a cup.
Right. Even Brad Park, Park could have led the team, but he was held back. Yeah.
Well, when you talk about the 72 finals and how they lost to the Bruins, there's two words to describe why they lost to the Bruins, and those two words are Bobby Orr. Bobby Orr was at the top of his game at that time, and there was no beating a team with Bobby Orr. So
and also Jean Rattel. They had to play without Jean Rattel for most of that series too, because he had a broken ankle.
He was hurt. You're right.
Earlier in the season, and he was their best player, and he was out, and he brought in Phil Goyette to replace him, but that's I didn't see why he did that, other than the fact that he knew Goyette, he knew what he could do, and he knew the system, but he was an older man, and he didn't last long in between Hadfield and Gilbert. I think they brought in Bobby Rousseau towards the end of that series.
Yeah, that's right.
So
Emile also, I'm sure he enjoyed the coaching part of it, but he wasn't hesitant about changing coaches and bringing in other guys. He brought in Boom Boom Jeffrey on to coach for a while. He brought in Larry Popine to coach for a while. And every time that happened, he wound up behind the bench again anyway, So that was Emile.
Well, Boom Boom had an ulcer. That's what we've been told anyway. So that's why he didn't.
Yeah, he collapsed in a game out in the West Coast. He collapsed after a game, and it probably was an ulcer. But I think he was on his way out anyway at that point. And he brought in Boom Boom originally because Boom Boom was one of the players that Boom Boom had been at when he was playing. When he brought him up as a player, Boom Boom had been out of hockey for I believe a year or two after starring with the Canadians. But Emile, again, in this quest to try to give some symbolism to the team and to try to give them some energy and to try to maybe bring someone who had been a Stanley Cup winner. So that's when he brought in Jeffrey on, and he was always trying things, and he was always trying something to get his team. He was always thinking. He was always thinking.
Yeah. And then he brought in Larry Popine, and that didn't work out at all because Popine got off on the wrong foot with Rod Gilbert right away, and the rest of the team kind of mutinied against him, and he didn't last long at all. So,
also, I believe that it was Francis who traded probably the one star that they had at the time was Andy Bathgate. He traded Bathgate to Toronto, and he got three players back who became mainstays for the Rangers: Bob Nevin, Rod Sealing, and Arnie Brown. Arnie Brown,
right? Yeah, that was a good trade because Andy was getting older, and when he was with the Rangers, and it was good for him because he went up there and he won a cup, and it was good for the Rangers because they got three players that they used for the next
10 years,
probably 5-6 years, or more, Arnie Brown and Rod Sealing were around for a long time. Bob Nevin was a little older. He left first. He went to Minnesota, but guys like Sealing and Brown, they were mainstays for a long time.
And Bob Nevin became the captain of the team.
Yes.
And here was the kind of thing also that Emile had to cope with. Players didn't want to come to New York. Bob Nevin, after he had become established and was the team captain, told me that when he was traded to New York, he thought it was the worst possible thing that could have happened to him.
Wow.
That's how badly New York was regarded by.
That was the reputation. That was the Rangers' reputation. You're right.
Yeah. Well, that's what happened with Red Kelly in the 50s. He got traded to the Rangers, and
Correct.
He didn't want to report. He
refused to report. That's
come.
right.
And they had a call up trade. We had traded Eddie Shack and a few other players to Detroit for him, and they had a call off the trade, and then Puncher Imlach stepped in and he grabbed Red Kelly, and Kelly won a couple more cups up with the Leafs, and the Rangers were stuck with without anything. So, but that's what everybody thought of the Rangers. They didn't want to go there. They had a bad reputation, and Emile came in and he had to change that culture. He had to make it attractive for the players to come here.
Yeah,
well, when you say a bad reputation, I would point out to you that I was born in 1939, and the year after that, the Rangers won the Stanley Cup. That's 1940. Right. Since then, they've won one Stanley Cup. We're talking about 80 years.
Yes.
So, that's not a great resume, I think.
No.
And, that certainly plays into it. People know that if you're going to the Canadiens won the Stanley Cup how many times, and you've got a good chance, although not this year, but you've got a good chance otherwise. But until Emile came to New York, you're right. New York was considered to be kind of like the cellar dweller of a 6-team league.
Right.
Every year. That's right. Every year, the last two teams in the league were going to be the Bruins and the Rangers.
Right.
And it was just a question of who was going to finish fifth and who was going to finish sixth.
Yeah. Well, they always said, too, that the Bruins and the Rangers would play for the Patrick Cup because Muzz Patrick was the GM for the Rangers and Lynn Patrick was the GM for the Boston Bruins. And there was this fictional cup called the Patrick Cup. And whoever came in fifth would win the cup, and, so.
I'll tell you how little regard the New York Times had for it. I was sitting in the office one day. I was the office reporter as a young guy in sometime in the 60s, and it was Columbus Day. And this is 12 o'clock noon on Columbus Day, and the assistant sports editor looks at the schedule and he says, "Hey, the Rangers are opening the season tonight, and we don't have anyone covering the game." They didn't even know that the Rangers were opening the season in Boston. And I went up. I'm not sure if it was 65 or 66. I went up, and the Rangers won a game. They scored about 5 or 6 goals. Reggie Fleming on the Bruins got into a fight, and the editors liked my story, and I became the hockey guy. But this was the kind of thing when you consider that the National Hockey League team, 6 teams in a whole league. The New York Times, the most important paper in the country, doesn't know that the Rangers are opening the season that night. 12 o'clock, I got to the game just as they were playing the national anthem. I caught the shuttle. I caught the shuttle that night. And that night, and the way they did things then, that night, the players for the Rangers slept on a railroad track on a siding, in a train on a railroad siding because Emile didn't want to spring for a hotel room for the night. and of course they didn't charter planes, so he got them onto a sleeper. They spent the night in a sleeper, and at about 5 o'clock in the morning took off in New York, and we arrived around 11 o'clock in the morning.
Wow.
That was the way it was done back then.
Those were the days, huh?
Yeah. Until Emile transformed them, And he really did.
That's you just said it, Gerry. He transformed that franchise. They were a struggling team that happened to be in the league, and that was about it until he came along, and he transformed that franchise into a meaningful New York franchise. You know, you're in New York. This is the biggest city in the country. I mean, you want to represent it properly, and he had that in him, that fire in him, to try and make this team significant and meaningful team, and he did. He did.
Yeah, he really turned everything around. And then when they moved into the new Madison Square Garden, they opened everything up, and people, he was sold out every night. You couldn't get tickets, and it all took off from there. Probably half the people from 1994 who held up signs that said "Now I can die in peace" were children of the people who went to the old Garden and went to the first few games in the new Garden those first few years. It gets passed on, and that was all because of Emile's work.
I remember going to the press conference when Emile was leaving the Rangers to go to the St. Louis Blues, and he said, you could tell how crestfallen he was and heartbroken he was that he was leaving the Rangers. And he said, wherever I go, there'll always be a Ranger tattoo on my butt. He felt that, he felt an attachment to the Rangers, regardless of who was signing the paychecks for him. Because he really transformed that. I think Gerry used the word transformed. He really transformed that franchise and made it a meaningful team.
Yeah. Well, at the time, the problem he ran into with the Rangers was a guy named Alan Cohen, Alan Bottom Line Cohen, and Cohen is a guy who wanted Emile gone. And years later, when Emile was working for Hartford, Alan Cohen had left the Garden, and he was forming a group that was going to buy the Boston Celtics, I think. And one of the reporters in Hartford called Emile and asked him what he thought about Alan Cohen going into basketball. And Emile said, "If I saw that guy standing in the middle of the street, I would run that son of a bitch right over." He just didn't like Alan Cohen, and Alan Cohen didn't like him.
It's tough not to like Emile. I think Gerry would agree. It would be tough not to like Emile. Emile was such a gracious, outgoing guy. He was a fun guy to be around. At least I found that to be the case.
Yeah, he was funny.
The only bitterness I ever saw him have was about when he was canned from the Rangers or had to leave the Rangers.
Yes, I agree.
And, who was they? Remember they used to call him Bottom Line Cohen.
Alan Cohen.
Who was the one
Cohen.
Who was the one that said, "I'm a hockey man and you're a bottom line man"? And that sort of did it. That became Alan Cohen's. He was very upset about that tag that he had, is about Bottom Line Cohen. And years later, I wrote about something with him, and I called him, and he sort of laughed about it, But I guess things years later become, a little. You look at life a little bit differently, as opposed to the anger at the moment,
Yeah.
But Hal is absolutely right about the kind. Emile was a very accommodating guy. From a newspaper reporter's point of view, you could reach him any time of the day or night.
Call him any time. That's right. He was always available. You're right about that.
Okay. Quite amazing. Those kind of things don't happen anymore because it's a very different world now between, the player, and the reporter and the general manager and the. But this was a guy, and here's we had to juggle also when you think about it. As a general manager, or as a coach, he's trying to get the best out of players. That as a general manager, he's saying, "Well, you're not worth that much money." So here he is arguing salary. Here he is arguing salary with John Rattel or Brad Park or Roger Bear, and then as a coach, he's got to get the best out of them. Yeah. So it was a hell of a juggling act that is just almost unprecedented in sports.
I think he had to be one of the first to wear two hats both general manager and coach. I'm not sure. I wouldn't swear to it, but it seems to me that he was one of the first to do both those jobs. And precisely what Gerry just said, how difficult that had to be. On the one hand, on game night, urging a player to get to hustle and run down the ice and hit that other guy and score that goal or so forth. And on the other hand, when he comes in to negotiate a contract, you say to him, well, you had so many and so many minus days, and you're not really worth that kind of money. That's a difficult trick to balance. A difficult balancing act.
Yeah. But he did. He did the best he could.
He's just a fun guy to be around. When I heard the news the other day, I was just crestfallen. I write a column for a website, local website, and I said I ought to write a column about Emile, and then I just said to myself, I can't. It's the second time that's happened to me in the last year or so. I was close with Henry Aaron, the great Henry Aaron, and I was driving home from wherever, I don't know, and I heard on the radio that Hank Aaron had died, and I was just, it just took the life out of me. I was so blue about it. And the same thing with Emile. I wanted to write, but I just couldn't. I just couldn't bring myself to do it.
Hal, it's interesting you say that because I had the opposite reaction. I wanted to write about him for the Times, so I called the editor at the Times, and he said, yeah. And and in writing about him, because I was sort of recreating my own career. Because I started, the first hockey game I ever saw was the one they sent me to in Boston, and Emile taught me so much about the game, and he was always available, and so I was sort of reliving my early years, and it was like I was telling a memoir, but in which he was the star and not me, and he had that effect on us. And I mean, when we'd get together, we'd be talking about Emile as much as the players.
It's true. It's true. He was a character. He was a character. He was one of a kind. They don't make him like that anymore. I'll tell you. He was a hail fellow, well met. He was just a great guy to be around. And I remember, as I said to you before, my first year working with the Rangers. It was my second year working with the Rangers as a PR guy, and having him in the next office was a treat. Because he'd always have stories to tell, and he'd always hanging out and having fun, he was just a fun guy to be around. Yeah. And he became a very successful coach and general manager of that team.
Yeah, and he had that voice and that Canadian cadence to the way he spoke. It was just, it was just wonderful to listen to him tell those stories. I could listen all day,
One of the things he liked to say, you often when you see somebody for the first time after a while, you say, how are you doing? He wouldn't say how you doing. He'd say, how you keeping?
Yeah.
I thought that was very odd,
Yeah.
But that's fine, I'm keeping fine.
Yeah. Well, he was active even, in his old age. I called him one day just to see how he was doing, and he had to call me back because he was actually taping a TV commercial in his living room for one of the local the places down in Florida, and that he just kept going,
Well, he was only 92 or 93 at the time, right?
Yeah. But he had to take care of his wife, Em, who was sick, and he was always saying that he was on the third shift. He had two caregivers that came in on 8-hour shifts, and he was on the third shift. And we would talk, and I would take notes. I would record them, and that's how I got the book. And but he always gave me time. There was one time I called him, and he was out, and I had to leave a message with one of the caregivers, and he called me back a little while later, and he goes, "Hello, George, this is Emile Francis." And I said, "Oh shit, I've been traded," and he laughed like hell, and he was just that kind of a guy, I had a good time with him.
He was just a fun guy to be around. He just above and beyond his professionalism and ability as a coach and a general manager, he was a fun guy to be around. He was the kind of guy you like to hang out with. That's how I would put it.
Yeah. He would always keep you entertained.
And you know that the you mentioned earlier in the show the catching glove. You know where he got that from? He got that from George McQuinn, who was a first baseman with the Yankees at that time, 1947 or thereabouts, I guess. And he adopted that from the McQuinn's first baseman's glove.
Yeah, they put a cuff on it, and he used it in the game, and the referee, wasn't going to, have him use it. And he said, well, if I can't use this now, I'll have to leave the game, and you don't have a goalie, so you're going to have to let me play. And then he had to go see Clarence Campbell, and they got it approved, and then later on that year, the CCM came out with the same glove.
That's pretty significant for a guy who only played 95 games in the league to have come up with a major part of the equipment that's still used today.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. He was an innovator in more ways than one.
Terrific guy.
Yeah. So, anybody got anything else?
Well, we could probably go for another. We could probably go for a full season with this guy with all the stories. But I think we hit the highlights of his, of our connections with him and what he had done. I think that was it's really fascinating, and I'm sure for Hal as well as for me in thinking how much of our own time in hockey was, how important he was for the time we spent in hockey.
Without question, Gerry, that's a very good point.
Yeah. Well, here's the coach of the Rangers. When I first got into the sport, and those were the Rangers that I grew up with, and it's a big loss. It's a loss that you feel right away, and then later on when you think about some more. So he'll be missed by a lot of people.
Yeah. No question about that.
So. Okay, guys, thank you very much for being on the show. I appreciate it.
It's been a lot of fun. It's been a lot of fun.
A lot of fun.
All right.
My pleasure. Yes. Okay, guys. Great talking.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Good talking to you guys. Take care. Good night.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.